sumbangan anda betapapun banyaknya membantu WSPOS memenuhi visinya.
寄付をすることで WSPOS と世界中の小児眼科をサポートにつながります。
Svetovno združenje za otroško oftalmologijo omogoča dostopno izobraževanje vsem. Če vam je bilo všeč, lahko donirate.
Apoyemos el proyecto de educación sin costo de la Sociedad Mundial de Oftalmopediatría y Estrabismo donando en su página web. Vale la pena.
Spende, damit wir Kinderkrankheiten weltweit bekämpfen können.
Dia membantu membawa pendidikan berkualiti dan pengetahuan yang baik kepada profesional mata anak-anak di seluruh dunia.
WSPOS इकट्ठे काम करते हैं और मिलके डोनेट कर सकते हो तो कर दो.
Eu já fiz a minha doação para a WSPOS. Faça você a sua. Juntos faremos a diferença.
Oproep aan alle orthopedisten. Steun WSPOS door gratis lid te worden en vrijblijvend een donatie te doen.
Yara, ẹ jẹ́ ká sowọ́pọ̀ pẹ̀lú WSPOS ká ràn wọ́n lọ́wọ́ pẹ̀lú nǹkan tọ́lọ̀ fi jíǹkì wa.
תרמו ל-WSPOS, וככה נקדם את הבריאות של ילדים בכל רחבי העולם. תודה רבה.
WSPOS बच्चों की आंखों की देखभाल करने वालों की एक संगठन है. मैंने WSPOS को अभी डोनेट किया है. कृपया आप भी कीजिए.
Molweni, igama no-WSPOS ndingathanda ukunicacisela okufitshane ndithi gqabagqaba malunga ne-World Society of Pediatric Ophthalmology.
WSPOS ಎಂಬುದು ಮಕ್ಕಳ ನೇತ್ರ ವಿಜ್ಞಾನ ಮತ್ತು ಕೂಸು ಕಣ್ಣಿನ ವಿಶ್ವ ಸಮಾಜ. ನಾನು WSPOSಗೆ ಈಗಾಗಲೇ ಆರ್ಥಿಕ ದೇಣಿಗೆ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ, ನೀವು ಸಹ ಮಾಡಿ.
أحثكم إلى الانتساب إلى WSPOS لكي نكون عائلة واحدة ونتعلم معا وندعمها جميعا.
WSPOS 世界小儿眼科斜视学会是一个国际的慈善机构，在此呼吁大家跟我一起捐款支持全球的小儿眼科。
So if you like the webinars, if you like the videos, if you like the educational information that WSPOS has brought to your life, if you found it important, useful, or helpful, then join me in donating to WSPOS.
To me, I've never understood the concept that in order for you to share your ideas, you have to pay large sums of money to a society. We do it. It's what's expected, but it doesn't have to be that way.
See, information shouldn't be costly. Information that helps people shouldn't cost anything if we can avoid that. Information should be shared. And since knowledge, the information that we have, resides all over the world, how do we make sure that we share that? How do we democratize education?
The World Society of Pediatric Ophthalmology and Strabismus is a society where all eye care professionals who are involved in children's eye care can join. This is not a conventional society where membership fee will be charged.
Every member, without paying any membership fee, has access to information about strabismus and pediatric ophthalmology.
WSPOS is moving to a new mode of communication, and we are trying to get better, to get connected all over the world.
WSPOS is a truly dynamic society which has brought together people from all walks of life, from different continents, to share knowledge, to share experiences, and more so in Africa, we have learned a lot. My African colleagues have testified to this.
Have you watched the World Society of Pediatric Ophthalmology and Strabismus webinars? They are great. Through them, we can learn, update, and share experiences with colleagues from all over the world.
These webinars are free to everyone. These webinars have been attended by people, ophthalmologists from everywhere.
So if you like the webinars, if you like the videos, if you like the educational information that WSPOS has brought to your life, if you found it important, useful, or helpful, then join me in donating to WSPOS.
That's why I donate to WSPOS.
This is why I'm donating to WSPOS.
That's why I donate to WSPOS.
I just made my donation, and I hope you can join me. Together, we can make the difference.
Your donation, however much, helps WSPOS fulfills its vision. Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the World Society of Pediatric Ophthalmology and Strabismus webinar on inherited retinal diseases. I'm David Granite. Today, you'll be hearing from world experts, literally spanning the globe. So I get to say good morning here in San Diego, where it's 6 o'clock in the morning, and we get to say the time all the way around the world in the East Coast of the United States, where it's 9 o'clock, in London and most of Europe, where it's the afternoon, in South America, where it's morning, heading towards afternoon, in Africa, where it is also afternoon, in the Middle East, where it is late afternoon, heading to early evening, into Asia, where it is now evening, and into Australia, where it is now officially night. So we span the globe with you today, and we welcome you to this special webinar. We want to thank our sponsors, Novartis, and today especially NTOD. For those of you that don't know, today is NTOD's 43rd Founders Day, very special day in the history of their company. And I will admit my lack of knowledge to realize that NTOD meant ENT, ophthalmology, and dermatology. So we thank them for their support of all these webinars for doctors around the world. Please don't forget, we'll have Menti questions that will be reminded to you by our moderators and our hosts. The code is 8482, and those questions are and should be already up. So we have just one more thing I want to tell you about, and that is the Worldwide Connect 2020. The World Congress of Pediatric Ophthalmology and Strabismus has gone virtual, but in a way you've never seen before. You'll have 24 hours of incredible, absolutely amazing content that's going to come to you from around the world. Stay tuned for the official announcements, but with a wink, I tell you, it's going to be amazing. Eduardo, if I can have the slides up, I will get out of the way and bring us to our webinar now. I get the distinct pleasure of introducing our two official moderators, Arif Khan and Eduardo Silva. Arif is, I just learned recently, like me, from Long Island, which is maybe the most important thing I can tell you about him. And he is now a consultant in pediatric ophthalmology and strabismus, as well as ocular genetics at the Cleveland Clinic, but in Abu Dhabi in the UAE. He's a professor of ophthalmology at the Cleveland Clinic, Lerner College of Medicine. He's chair of the editorial committee for the AAO, the BCSC committees, the American Academy. He's an editorial board member of Ophthalmic Genetics, an associate editor of he's one of the guys who runs all of genetics. Okay, what can I tell you? For ocular genetics, we try to get you the top and best people we could. And he has shared with us pictures with his beautiful family. Arif, where's that? What's the background there with the mountains behind you?
Austria.
Austria, that's beautiful and gorgeous. So thank you for joining us as one of our moderators. And our second moderator today in our next slide is Eduardo Silva, my dear friend and director of pediatric ophthalmology in Lisbon, Portugal. He is consultant in ocular genetics in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil as well. He does fellowship at the Wilmer Eye Institute in Johns Hopkins in the United States of America. He is professor of ophthalmology and genetics and participates in postgraduate trainings programs in Sao Paulo, Brazil, as well as Valencia, Spain. He has been on the executive and scientific committee for the World Society of Pediatric Ophthalmology, Retinal International, and Orphanet. Clinical and research interests include what you might expect: the management and genetics of ocular development disorders and retinal dystrophies. Eduardo I will share with you that my wife is disappointed that she's not here joining us because she enjoys Eduardo's company just so greatly, and with a smile always on his face and joy in everything he does. I now turn the program over to Eduardo, and I will fade into the background appropriately. Eduardo and Arif, enjoy. To all of our speakers, have a great time, and I will see you at the end. Thanks. Eduardo, it's all yours.
Thanks, David. So there's a few housekeeping items first, but I'm really excited to get started with this webinar. We have a stellar assembly. First of all, this is a webinar, so one of the benefits of a webinar is being interactive. So we ask everyone to have a separate browser open so they can go to menti.com and put in the Menti code 8482. There will be questions that are posed through the lectures, and there will be two questions coming before the first presentation. So again, menti.com 8482. Besides the questions coming from us, there will be questions from the audience. We hope to see many questions from the audience, and there are three platforms that these can be asked. One is through the comment section in YouTube, another is through Blueberry, and the other is through the Facebook platform. We will try to answer as many questions as possible during the webinar, but anything we cannot answer during the webinar, we'll answer later in PDF form. And the third housekeeping item, for those of you who need participation certificates, they're available if you email wspos@wspos.org after the presentation, then you can ask for the certificates, those who need them. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Birgit Lorenz as one of the presenters today. Birgit is Professor Emeritus from Gießen, Germany. She's President of the International Society of Genetic Eye Disease and Retinoblastoma, Founding President of the European Pediatric Ophthalmologic Society, a member of ERNI, which is a Rare Eye Disease Network, and she's co-chair of the Pediatric Rare Eye Disease section. And she's also steering member, committee member of eVicarNet, which is another European clinical research network. I've really had the pleasure of knowing Birgit through her career, her illustrious career, and a large part of it has been with patients with inherited retinal disease who are now eligible for gene therapy. So I'm very excited to hear what she has to say for us. I'll now pass on to Eduardo for the rest of the introductions. Eduardo?
Thank you very much, Arif. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good night to all of you participating all over the world. I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm very happy to be part of this amazing endeavor. Just to let you know that right now we already have participants watching from a lot of countries worldwide, including Lebanon, Brazil, Portugal, Oman, Indonesia, Sweden, Iran. Thanks for being here. Thanks for watching. Something that I wanted to share with you, and I've read this sentence from Gordon Hinckley, and I was really touched by it. Being humble means recognizing that you're not on earth to see how important you can become, but to see how much of a difference you can make in the lives of others. And I truly believe that this is our goal in life, and that we will have more complete lives if we abide to this quote. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce the rest of the panel. And first off is Dave Mackey. I've known David for quite some time now. He is a professor in ophthalmology from the University of Tasmania in Western Australia. He's chair of the Western Australian branch of the Australia Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, counselor of the Asia Pacific Academy of Ophthalmology, past president of the ISCED, and also editorial member of Ophthalmic Genetics. And he has devoted his life to ophthalmic genetics. He's one of the top experts in the world in ophthalmic genetics, and it's a pleasure to have him as my friend. Next is Alki Liassis. Alki is originally from Cyprus, but he is now professor of ophthalmology at UPSM. He's director of the Electrophysiology service, but previously he was in London, working at the National Hospital of Neurology and also at Gosh, Great Ormond Street for Children's in London, UK. And here's a photo of Alki with his lovely family, his better half, and 2 kids. And last but not least, and I'm going to give him the stage right away, Dr. Elias Travolsi, my dear friend Elias, originally from Lebanon. We've had the chance to interact many times in the past, and I've learned a great deal from him. Elias right now is professor of ophthalmology at Cleveland Clinic, College of Medicine in Case Western University, director of the Center of Genetic Eye Diseases and Department of Ophthalmology at the Cole Eye Institute. He's the editor for Ophthalmic Genetics, and of course, I'm pretty sure that a great number of you know him from being one of the big masters in ophthalmic genetics, and he's also executive VP of ISCED. His better half is in this photo, Maya. Maya is crucial in Elias's life, as are his kids, and now they have this addition to the family, this beautiful dog that is displayed here at their place in this photo. I'm going to give the stage back to Elias, but before that, just a reminder that the Menti numerical code is 8482. Don't forget to answer the questions, and also you have a QR code just in case. Thanks, and I'm going to stop sharing so that you can have the stage for yourself. Elias Travolsi, thank you very much.
Elias, you're muted. You need to turn your microphone on. Thank you.
David knew this was going to happen. Look at him shaking his head. So I'm delighted to be with all of you this morning from my home in Cleveland, and I hope in a short period of time to cover this topic of systemic investigations, and systemic involvement in patients with retinal dystrophies. And in fact, diagnosing childhood retinal dystrophies is a very stepwise process in which we have to go through drawing a pedigree, asking the appropriate questions, identifying a category where the disease fits in, then going to a clinical diagnosis based either on specific pathognomonic, clinical, or imaging findings, and finally going to the molecular testing to confirming or modifying our clinical diagnosis. As a general rule, we have to, as a first step, ask the most important question, which is, does this patient only have an eye problem, or does this patient have a systemic disease with an eye problem? Because that determines the way we are going to proceed with the management of the patient. If we find that there is indeed evidence of a related systemic disease, then we have to involve other people in the management of this patient, the appropriate medical specialist, and maybe a genetic service. Nowadays, we can even go straight from suspecting or making a clinical diagnosis of a systemic disease to genetic testing. Let us look at this one case example. And this is a patient in whom the diagnosis was not very clear at the beginning when she presented with nystagmus at about 6 months of age. She had had pneumonia. We knew she had some heart disease, but it was thought to be just a congenital heart disease. She was very light sensitive. She had limited vision. She was hypermetropic, and on her retinal exam, she did have evidence of a retinopathy. She underwent an electroretinogram and showed indeed no recordable responses. So our clinical diagnosis was one of Leber congenital amaurosis, and at the time, in 2008, 2010, the available testing did not identify any mutations in the available genes. Now, as she grew up, she started developing some other clinical findings, and a workup with genetics actually put her in the syndromic category. She had an eating disorder, she was heavy, she had some autistic features, she had a sleep disorder, and she also developed some hearing loss. At the time, a microarray was done, an MRI was done, they were both normal. A few years later, she had a baby sister, and the baby sister was diagnosed with a dilated cardiomyopathy. When we examined her, we found that she had very similar ocular findings. This particular clinical finding actually made a light bulb go up, and I said, oh, dilated cardiomyopathy, I know what that is, and I suspected that it was indeed Alström syndrome. So we went ahead and obtained genetic testing for Alström syndrome, and indeed the two sisters carried mutations in that gene. In fact, when I went back and looked at patients from my clinic who presented with a retinal dystrophy and had systemic diseases, I found that Alström syndrome was the most common. Now remember, you are in different parts of the world, and maybe what I see in my clinic is not what you see in your environment. It may be Bardet-Biedl syndrome. It may be neuronal ceroid lipofuscinosis. It may be another condition. But at least in our area, that's what we see. So keep it in mind. It's a very, very rare condition, maybe 1 in a million live births. And I have a list here of the clinical findings. You can find that in your textbooks, so we're not going to belabor that too much, except to say that Alström syndrome is one of that big category of systemic diseases with retinal findings that I'm sure you've heard of and you know of, and those are the ciliopathies. So somehow in Alström syndrome, one of the proteins, one of the components of the ciliary machinery is not working. And when that happens, not only the photoreceptors don't work, but a lot of other body systems don't work. This is an older slide given to me by my dear friend Hélène Dolphus from Strasbourg, and it shows the different types of ciliopathies that can involve a number of systems, including the eye. For the longest time, we did not know what caused Bardet-Biedl syndrome and how the bone, how a patient could have polydactyly and a retinal problem, but that explains it. Other ciliopathies of interest include evidently Bardet-Biedl syndrome. That's probably one of the more common ones. Senior Loken, Joubert, and I show you here an image of the molar tooth sign in a patient with Joubert syndrome, and Jeanne syndrome, which is pretty rare, but I saw this one girl. You see how her chest cage is narrow, and she has short arms, and she has a retinopathy. Many of these conditions are genetically heterogeneous, which means multiple gene mutations can cause them. Bardet-Biedl, I think we're up to, I don't know, 16, 18, 20 different genes that cause Bardet-Biedl. So wrapping up, when do we investigate, or I shouldn't say when do we investigate, we're always investigating our patients with retinal dystrophy for systemic abnormalities. It's how do we do that? We do it by, number one, maintaining a high index of suspicion, obtaining a very good review of systems, looking at the whole patient. They're standing right there in front of you. You can pick up on what they have just by looking at them. Check your ciliopathy list for a match of findings. Talk to the pediatrician and other specialists, and then image them as needed. There is no shotgun approach here. You have to obtain your workup depending on what you find on clinical examination. There are several categories of systemic diseases with retinal degeneration: metabolic, the ciliopathies we've talked about, and finally, the one that you should never, ever forget is the neurodegenerative category, with patients who could have neuronal ceroid lipofuscinosis or Batten disease, who can present to you with RP and then only to go on to develop seizures, deterioration of their neurological functions, and unfortunately, their lifespan is very limited. So I hope I didn't take more than my allocated time, and I'm sure we are going to have some interesting questions in a minute. So, obrigado, efharisto, thank you, shukran, and it's wonderful to be with all of you.
Thank you so much, Elias. Really, this highlights such important points, and there are a lot of discussion points. We can go on from that, but I'd like to ask Birgit to get her presentation ready, and after her presentation, we'll have discussion of both presentations. I myself personally, as you say, when I see a child with a retinal dystrophy, I'm uncomfortable because of the possibility of underlying systemic disease, which is why one of the reasons why I really favor genetic testing, so we can rule in or even rule out that possibility. But let's talk more about this after Birgit's presentation. Birgit, please.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm really very happy to be part of this webinar, and I'm going to talk on what is so important. So inherited retinal diseases or retinal dystrophies, there is now a good number of gene-based therapies, and we can differentiate gene addition therapy, which is the most frequent form, either via subretinal approach, which is now done for RP65 associated early onset retinal dystrophies, for choroideremia, for achromatopsia, for X-linked RP, and an intravitreal approach is used for X-linked retinitis, retinoschisis. Then only at the experimental level, although the first patient has been treated now, is gene correction by genome editing, a very challenging method, which would be superior to gene addition therapy, I think, but there is challenges I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then still another approach, intravitreal antisense oligonucleotide, which is also done in CEP290 associated LCA. So just to remind you that there is a huge phenotypic and genotypic variability, and we now know at least 250 genes the mutations of which are associated with different forms of either isolated rod cone or cone rod dystrophy or syndromic forms, as we just heard from Elias. So, gene therapy is a therapy of monogenic diseases, and it's specific to each gene. So the aims at present, or what is possible at present, is that we can reverse at least partially the functional deficit as shown for RP65, and I will come to Luxturna at the end of the talk. Then preservation of the remaining retina, that is what is attempted with treating choroideremia. And similar also for X-linked RP associated with mutation in RPGR, although in the latter there is some data that would be even more encouraging, showing that there may be restoration of morphology. All those therapies clearly need longitudinal natural history studies, because it's not complete reversal of the disease, but either slowing or ideally stopping the disease process. So all people interested in IRDs, of course, are aware of the gene therapy for RP65, which is a gene addition therapy. And this is already back in 2009 when the first results were published from the phase 1/2 gene trial conducted at CHOP in Philadelphia. And what you can see, it's ordered by age, that mainly you get an improvement in rod function, evidenced by increased light sensitivity, that is, people can navigate in dim lights after therapy. Whereas cone function is not so much changed, the results are much more ambiguous about that feature. So the encouraging results were carried on to phase 3 that ultimately led to the approval of the drug voretigen nepavolvarec, now called Luxturna, as a medication that can be now used in the US, in Europe, and also first patients have been treated in Saudi Arabia. So this is now in a little bit larger cohort, about 31 patients, and what you can see that with this MLMT, that is called the mobility parcours with multiple luminance levels, light levels, MLMT, you can see that all patients did show a significant increase in sensitivity. That means that with low light levels, they could navigate. And the same result is shown by a test that is called FST, full field light stimulus threshold, where also you can see and measure this increase in sensitivity, and that means a much better performance in dim light. When you look at visual acuity, the results are less favorable, but you can see, and this is also important, that's why it's important to do natural history studies, that the control eye here also showed some improvement. That's the problem of psychophysical testing with repeat measurements. So we have got to be very careful when judging about results. So this brings me to the natural history of RP65 mutation-associated IRDs. And this shows that there is a constant decline in visual acuity and also in visual field over the decades. But you can see also that there is an important scatter. So we really need to have to collect more data. And again, RP65 is a rare disease. It's estimated to be about 1 in also in 500,000 maybe. So natural history, this is maybe a complicated slide, but it shows for one patient follow-up over 20 years that there is an increasing degeneration of the retina. But when you look at the OCT, you can see that even at the age of 29 years, in the center of the retina, there is still preservation of structures that is also labeled as viable cells. So cells that can function, because the gene therapy, of course, requires viable cells, and in RP65, the gene defect is located in the retinal pigment epithelium, so you have got to address the retinal pigment epithelium. There are exceptional cases with much less severe disease course, and this is shown by this patient who has almost full visual acuity at the age of 9 years, and even at the age of 15, visual acuity is still well preserved. And the OCT looks much better, of course. And today there is a debate, of course, which would be the best window of opportunity to treat patients. Of course, the best would be well-preserved retina, and there is a very recent paper published by the Sam Jacobson and Arthur Sidesian group showing that the areas of well-preserved retina after gene therapy continued to have a good morphology compared to a more advanced atrophy, where there is, despite gene therapy, progressive atrophy. So very clearly, as I pointed already out, the requirements for gene-based therapies are that there is viable target cells. So OCT is very useful. Adaptive optics is another option, also difficult in patients with nystagmus. You need to know the genotype. And what does this mean? In autosomal recessive disease, you need to have mutations on both alleles, biallelic disease. So when you have a patient with 2 mutations, this is not enough for proving biallelic disease, because you can have mutations on the same allele. So what you need to do is segregation analysis. You have got to test the patient, the parents if available, or siblings or children. In X-linked disease, of course, again, it's hemizygous disease causing mutation that you need to identify. Autosomal disease is much more complicated, and so far there is no clinical trial as far as I know, because many of the mutations have a dominant negative effect, so it's not adding the gene that is effective, but you have also to remove the diseased allele. So why is it important to test for the genotype? This is a very nice paper, and it shows a very complicated pedigree. So the black symbols represent patients with autosomal dominant RP associated with mutations in rhodopsin. So this father married a mother who has apparently rod cone dystrophy. And the index patients were 2 boys, both with nystagmus. So the question is, what is the underlying disease in those children? So the older, had a mutation in a gene that is associated with incomplete congenital stationary night blindness. And when you look at the pedigree from the maternal side, you see that there are several affecteds, and indeed the mother, as well as the affected boy, carries a mutation in the CAGNA1F gene. But this mother also carries a mutation, 2 mutations in the ABCA4 gene, and her mother, she was heterozygous for ABCA4, but the father, he was also heterozygous. So they did not have Stargardt disease, of course, but the mother, unfortunately, she inherited from both parents the mutant allele. She's compound heterozygous for ABCA4. So clearly, that's what she has. But what is about the second son? So very unlikely, but in this family this happens. He has a new mutation in a gene, MITIF gene, that is associated with Waardenburg syndrome. And he has indeed macular hyperplasia as a reason for the nystagmus. So the nystagmus in the 2 boys has 2 different underlying diseases. And this family, I think, clearly shows that when you have a family with multiple affected, you really have to prove the genotype in each affected patient in order to be sure that if there is gene therapy, that he's the right person for the gene you want to treat. So gene addition therapy, how does it work? now it's called gene augmentation, but I'm not sure that I like this expression, because in fact, you don't want to augment the diseased gene, you want to add the healthy gene. So how does it work? So most commonly used AAV, adeno-associated vectors, are used where the viral DNA is replaced by the therapeutic gene. And the envelope of the virus vectors is used to penetrate first the cell and then also the nucleus. You have got to introduce the new gene in the nucleus, where then the double-stranded DNA is located as episomes. It's now thought that it's for many years or maybe for the whole lifetime. And this DNA, double-stranded DNA, starts making the good gene.
Birgit, I think that we need to wrap up. Otherwise, you're going to go over time.
Okay. So the gene is delivered by subretinal surgery. As seen here, there is other approaches that are tried. And this video shows that the best way is to do this with intraoperative OCT. So the viral vectors that are used, AAV, can carry only a smaller genes. That's why not all genes are amenable to gene therapy with viral vectors. Genome editing is complicated. I mentioned it already. So the idea is to really cure the gene in its location. And there is the first trial with SEP290. And the intravitreal injection with antisense oligonucleotide is still another approach where the pre-mRNA is corrected by adding antisense nucleotide so that the correct copy is formed. So the take-home messages: precise genotyping is really essential. To date, mainly gene addition therapies for autosomal recessive and X-linked IRDs are in use. Natural history studies and post-treatment follow-up is essential, and I want to emphasize this. Even with Luxturna, it's very important to do those follow-up studies in order to understand better which patients will profit most from the therapy, and we really have a high need to define this window of opportunity. So that's my wrap-up.
Good. Thank you very much, Birgit, for your talk. You need to stop sharing your screen now, please. And these two very fine presentations are now open for discussion. We already have some questions coming from the audience, and these are actually very interesting. Some of the questions. One of the questions is gene testing available around the world, and how much does it cost? Who pays for this? And so this is open for the panel. Elias, you want to start?
Yes. I would think that certainly in the Americas, in Europe, in the Middle East, India, Japan, gene therapy, gene testing is definitely available, at least to those who can afford it. Let's put it this way. In Europe and the US, we are able to obtain coverage and pay for gene testing, I believe, almost everywhere. In other parts of the world, it continues to be a major issue, but samples could be sent out and testing done in Europe or in the US, and the results gone back to the ordering physician.
Yeah, one of the interesting questions also from the audience on YouTube is segregation analysis essential for therapy? Dave Mackey, you want to say something about this?
Well, sometimes it won't be possible to do, so it's ideal. Again, it will depend on what the funding arrangements are. Some will have that as a requirement for it to be funded, others it won't. So I think it's something ideally that should be done, but isn't always possible.
Yes. Yeah, I share the same view. And I would
Can I make a comment about that? You know, of course, we want segregation analysis. It's not always possible, but we're thinking about Luxturna. And as Birgit was saying, the RPE65 phenotype is pretty characteristic. It often is characteristic. And if we have a very characteristic phenotype, I mean, that is more evidence, even if we don't have the segregation analysis, as opposed to not having the segregation analysis and not having a phenotype that is so typical. So the phenotype really comes in as well.
But my view on that is that we really should try to have segregation analysis, and we always do it. Of course, parents are not always available, but there may be siblings, etc. As long as you can prove that one mutation is really limited to one allele, you know much better that the mutations that you found are really disease-causing. So
I think that
I wouldn't do gene therapy without knowing that the two mutations reported are on two separate alleles.
Yes, but at least in this region of the world, many of the mutations are homozygous.
So, well, that's different. Then it's okay. Homozygous is not the problem.
Yes,
but when it's compound heterozygous, it's not proven that it's on two alleles.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I think what matters the most is that we are convinced that the mutations in that gene match the clinical phenotype in that patient and are responsible for it. If segregation analysis is available, fine and good. If not, and the team who's taking care of that patient is absolutely certain that this is an RPE65 patient who has two mutations, then as far as I'm concerned, it's good enough.
Well, let me add something to this. As all the audience is watching, we're having a lot of fun discussing these issues. We always should keep an open mind when looking at a patient with a retinal dystrophy. And Elias brought up one essential point, which is you should always keep in mind that a syndromic phenotype is possible. But the crucial thing for someone who comes to an eye clinic is that you should ask the questions. If you don't ask the questions, the patient will not deliver the answer, and you'll never know what the right cause is. And the other thing is that never be afraid to say, well, sir, you have a cone rod dystrophy, and 2 years later, because the patient develops kidney symptoms or something related to another system, your diagnosis is going to change, because you should be prepared for that.
One way to make sure that happens, Eduardo, is discipline. So in your medical record, if you have a questionnaire with the specific questions that pertain to this, and you make sure that if your patient is coming for a retinal dystrophy evaluation, you ask those questions and you complete them, then you're good.
Arif?
Yes, absolutely. What I really want to stress, especially for the audience, is they have to be specific questions. If you ask open-ended question, very often, if you say, is there anything else, very often the family will say no. And if you say, was there ever polydactyly, they'll say, oh yeah, we had it and we just amputated it and we forgot about it. That is really common, especially in this region of the world where there's a lot of Bardet-Biedl syndrome. So I would really stress that the questions have to be pointed questions, not just open-ended, is there anything else? Because very often the families don't feel it's significant to tell an eye doctor.
Yes.
I agree with that. And I'm going to pass now the ball to Birgit, because there is another question online. And someone asked, does Luxturna improve nystagmus? What's your point? What's your take on this, Birgit?
Well, I have no personal experience, but it has been reported that nystagmus may improve. It has been shown in the dog, and it's also one of the reasons discussed why visual acuity improves because of dampening of the nystagmus. Nystagmus may be very faint in RP65 patients, but the reports are there, so why not?
I have experience with one patient where the nystagmus improved. It's hard to tease that out from the natural history, but the general natural history is worsening, so most likely it is from the treatment.
Well, I think we should move on now to the next speaker. Arif, you want to take?
Sure. So I'm very pleased to ask David to come up and start sharing his screen for his presentation. And I would like to remind the audience also to keep looking at the Menti questions. Menti questions are ongoing. There'll be more Menti questions during David's presentation as well. So David, please, a very interesting topic relevant to most of us around the world.
Thank you very much. I'd like to declare my financial disclosures of being a consultant for Novartis in getting licensing for Lux Turner in Australia. The first revolution in inherited retinal diseases really started with the invention of the ophthalmoscope. And over the next century, we had many people who often had their eponymous names attached to the syndrome describe specific phenotypes, some before Mendel's work was known and many after Mendel's work was known. And we now have a next revolution in the discovery of the genes for these phenotypes. Excitingly, over the 1980s and 90s, many of these genes were identified, and we now have over 250 genes identified on RetNet associated with inherited retinal dystrophies. The top genes found in the United States in Dager's group were listed here. A similar study in China showed the top genes listed from Zibeng's group. When we look at the overlap of these two studies, you can see a large number of genes are found in these quite disparate populations, suggesting these may be common around the world, whereas some other gene mutations may be more specific to particular populations. We find in general that the larger pedigrees are more likely to have a gene identified, whereas this is less often in sporadic cases. Because more work has been done in European and East Asian populations, these are more likely to identify a mutation, and it is less likely in ethnic minorities, an issue that we need to address as a global community. And sometimes phenotyping can guide us to a specific gene that needs to be tested. The next revolution in inherited retinal disease has been the gene-based therapies. And this is an alphabetical list of currently registered gene-based therapy trials. The public are well aware of this, and there have been cover stories in National Geographic looking at the DNA revolution, and this following month in the potential to end blindness. And thus many of our patients and their families know as much about these diseases as many clinicians. We actually have a three-pronged approach that we need to consider in managing our patients, remembering prevention, treatment, and rehabilitation. Now, we have heard of the various genetic possibilities of treatment, but we need to remember there are also stem cell treatments, bionics, as well as pharmacological research projects underway. But coming back to prevention, which is better than cure, we can use predictive DNA testing to allow counselling, antenatal testing, and pre-implant genetic diagnosis using in vitro fertilisation. Predictive testing allows people to decide whether they want to have children. Some families may choose to have antenatal testing and terminate an affected pregnancy, but this may not be available or acceptable to some parents. And other parents may choose to have pre-implant genetic diagnosis, but this has considerable cost and is not always successful. Rehabilitation is now more than just a dog, cane and braille. The things that blind people find most difficult are reading, recognising faces, navigating and driving. And with the revolution in artificial intelligence, we now have technologies that can compensate for these, such as the emerging driverless car and many apps that are available on the smartphone to assist visually impaired people. We've gone from the earliest technologies such as the JAWS reader through to technologies such as the Seeing AI app, which is free to anyone who owns an iPhone. And this technology allows us, or allows patients, to look at short text, documents, barcodes, and have them read to them, as well as recognising people or scenery or currency. In guiding our patients to the best available treatments and the best use of resources, we need to consider, for any particular family, do we need to be worrying about prevention versus treatment versus rehabilitation, and which will benefit our particular patient and their family the most? We need to direct people towards evidence-based medicine. However, often this is not available, and with many of the new gene therapies, we need to look at how can we get them involved in properly registered and conducted trials. There are also scientifically feasible treatments that can be considered. But what is most concerning is there is a lot of quackery out there, and we have to steer our patients away from this. To get testing available, we need to show the clinical and economic evidence and convince our local governments that they need to provide this for patients. Remembering patients and their families are very effective lobbyists, and they can campaign for governments and health fund providers to fund this work. And for testing, we really need to show that knowing the test results will allow families to make reproductive or treatment choices based on this information to convince the funders to pay for it. If we can't get it funded in the routine system, can we look at research groups who may be able to provide research-grade testing? However, there are ethical and legal challenges in the return of these results, and often the specific finding needs to be re-evaluated in an accredited local laboratory. For clinical trials, what happens when there isn't a trial in your country? Are patients eligible to travel to another country to be involved in a trial? What are the costs, and how long or how often will they need to be in the host country? And much of this is put on hold at the moment because of COVID-19. An example I have with Labor's optic neuropathy that I've been working on for over 30 years is that we showed we didn't have enough patients in our whole country each year to justify a trial site here. And some of our patients missed out for various reasons. But one 19-year-old back in 2015 crowdfunded $30,000 towards the cost of travel and treatment, tried to get involved in the Miami trial, although this hadn't started at the time and he would not be eligible once it had. But he did enroll in the GenSight trial and travelled to the United States for treatment, although unfortunately his vision in the longer term remained poor. These sort of stories of patients travelling to get treatment are of concern with what's now known as stem cell tourism. And we need to highlight to patients that there are dangers in having unproven treatments. And the New England Journal of Medicine highlighted patients who were blinded by an apparent stem cell treatment for age-related macular degeneration. We need to educate patients and their families how to tell the difference between genuine trials and quackery, how to know if it's appropriately registered and sponsored. And we need the patient support organisations to take the lead in this area and ensure that these organisations are up to date with their understanding. Who pays? Is it the patient and their families? Is it the insurers and the government? Or is it philanthropy? And many patients are resorting to crowdfunding. So in conclusion, Erasmus said prevention is better than cure, and this is available for many of the inherited retinal diseases now. We can now treat some of the inherited retinal diseases, but the prospect for this increasing is very exciting. And we can offer rehabilitation previously unimaginable. The dilemma of knowing whether to distribute our resources in these possibilities is really exciting, as none of them were available 30 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for this phenomenal talk. We really learned a lot with you. This is, and you've touched so many important points for both clinicians and patients. I wish we had the time now to discuss, but we're going to do this after Aki's talk. Just as a reminder, I would like to ask the audience to look at the Menti questions The code is 8482, and if you have the QR code, please use it now. Alki, you're up next. The stage is yours. Thank you.
Alki, while you're getting your slides up, I'm just going to let everybody know we have people from Argentina, Mexico, Syria, Israel, USA, Canada, Singapore, Kenya, the Philippines, Vietnam, Jordan, Pakistan, South Africa, the Dominican Republic, New Zealand, Australia, everywhere imaginable. And our Menti questions have been showing that people are here from all around the world. When we look at geographic location, most of the people are pediatric ophthalmologists, about 2/3, but we have about 1/3 of the people listening are general ophthalmologists who take care of patients, and we have some genetic specialists as well. And Elias, you'll be interested to know that your questions gave multiple answers for what would not be, think of Bardet-Biedl in a 6-year-old spread amongst all of the answers you gave. And similarly, although Batten disease was the #1 answer, all of the answers you gave for your second question were responded to positively. Birgit, your questions that you said, which of the following is not true? Gene addition therapy and inherited diseases. The most common answer was is independent of gene size, although 10 to 20% of the people answered all the other answers as well. And then, which of the following is not true of Luxturna? Mainly improves cone function was the #1 answer, but all of them had at least 15 to 20% for answers. And David, everyone agreed that parents and families can benefit from inherited retinal diseases for all the things that you mentioned. And there's a little bit of confusion over how many genes are currently available in the RetNet database, with 250 being the most common answer, but there are some people think that 22,000 are still available. So that's where we are on the Menti questions. Let me get out of the way and let Alki go ahead with his talk.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. I'd like to welcome everybody today, and I'm very privileged to be presenting from Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh with such a great group of presenters. My title was, What Routes Are There to Get an EIG in a Child, and Why Is It Important? I have no financial disclosures. I think we've probably heard about why it's important. I think phenotyping patients is very important, and EIGs are able to give us information about general retinal function, both photoreceptors and inner retina. It can focus on the macula globally and focally, and then it can also give us an idea of ganglion cell function. So I'm mainly going to stick to pattern EIGs, multifocal and flash EIGs, even though there's many different types of EIGs that we can record. The easiest ones to discuss in children are the pattern and the multifocal, and that's because ideally we need to use adult protocols. And the reasons for this is that the responses we record are quite small. They require corneal electrodes, steady fixation, and some of the multifocal devices actually require a subjective manipulation of the stimulus before recordings. So in our unit here, we typically record pattern EIGs in normal 5 to 6 year olds, and multifocal EIGs, because they're slightly smaller, in 6 to 7 year olds. We have ISCEV standards, and these are good when you're setting up new paradigms because they're able to tell us the standard stimuli to record and the recording parameters. If we move on to flash EIGs, it's recommended that we use pupil dilation, corneal electrodes, use a Ganzfeld, dark adapt for 20 minutes prior to the rod responses, then light adapt before we record our cone responses. And with this paradigm, usually with a normal child with no other comorbidity, we can record these responses in children of 6 years or above, or we can go to the OR or sedation unit and record these children asleep to get the responses. So the question I pose is, what can we do for the younger children and infants who do not tolerate corneal electrodes, but we don't want to take them to the sedation unit? Well, we have new devices coming online that have skin electrodes and handheld stimulators. We have conventional skin electrodes, and this is a newborn baby with these very small electrodes, and we have handheld stimulators that we can record responses to. And an extract from the international standard says, those recording ERGs must master the technical requirements of their chosen electrode to obtain a good contact, consistent electrode positioning, acceptable impedance, and ensure the waveforms are comparable to those of the ISCA standards. So to some extent, irrespective of which electrode we use or stimulating device, as long as we can reproduce the waveforms that are suggested by the ISCA standards, we're good to go. So in the early 90s, Dr. Tony Chris, one of my mentors at Great Ormond Street Hospital, showed that the skin ERG had an almost identical morphology to those recorded by corneal electrodes. And here we can see the retinal electrode, the A and B wave, and the skin electrode at the other end of the spectrum. And all that the difference was a scaling factor. So if the BA electrode records a response, let's say of 100%, the skin electrode records one at 12%. We can also improve the signal to noise ratio by signal averaging. And when we do that, the morphology becomes even more similar. So Tony Chris at the time developed a protocol where a child would undergo pattern reversal VEPs under mesopic conditions prior to his ERG recordings. He used skin electrodes, he didn't dilate the pupils, he used a handheld strobe, and he used colored filters to preferentially stimulate the rods during scotopic testing. And this is a little child we saw yesterday. She was so cute. So this is positioning of the electrodes. And just to show you how quickly we can record these ERGs, this is the dim blue flash, and we can see that the ERG is typical of a rod-driven response. And then after that recording, I'm just saving time, we can use a bright flash and record the mixed rod cone response. So this is a typical set of ERGs recorded using this protocol. We have the rod response, our mixed rod cone response, a scotopic red, a photopic single flash cone, and then a 30 Hertz flicker. And I think you can agree that these look very similar to what we would obtain with dilation, dark adaptation, and a Ganzfeld. And one way to show that is on the left-hand side is the skin protocol I just described, and on the right-hand side we have the same recording in the same slightly older child using a Ganzfeld, corneal electrodes, and stimulation. And if I superimpose one on top of the other, you can see definitely, apart from a scaling factor, here we've got 5 microvolts and here we have 50, is the morphology of the waveform for the flicker and the cone response are very similar. The maximal flash, the A wave, again, is very similar, and the rod-driven response is near identical. We do have some differences in the mixed rod cone response, where the B wave is slightly shorter, and I think this is due purely to kind of how much adaptation or how much photopically adapted you are, and children with brighter eyes have the slightly shorter B wave. This shows us that we can actually pick up pathology as well, not just normal ERGs. On the top, we have an on-off ERG in a control subject using skin electrodes. And again, in a 7-month-old, we can see that we have an A wave, a D wave, but the B wave is missing, so showing an on-pathway problem. So quickly to summarize, in terms of pattern ERGs and multifocal, we just have to wait until the child is old enough to tolerate recordings. Flash ERGs, when we need to, after the ages of around 6 years of age, we can use corneal electrodes, dilation, and a Ganzfeld. But we can also see that skin ERGs are a valid method for recording responses in these very young children, rather than taking them down to the OR or to the sedation unit. And in fact, they can be used with a Ganzfeld, not only in children, but in adults. In our adult department, we find many adults who are just not able to tolerate these corneal electrodes, regardless of a topical anesthetic. We can use them in conjunction with a handheld stimulator, and I've just shown we can use them without dilation. And recording the visually evoked potential at the same time within around 45 minutes, we can have an assessment of the retina down to the visual cortex in a child. But as with all electrophysiology, normative data is the most important. And for every paradigm you do and whatever you tweak, you need normative data for that. But hopefully up for discussion is that I've shown you that we can use skinny IGs as a protocol for those who we cannot tolerate corneal electrodes and maybe not have to sedate these children. Every electrophysiology unit is only as good as the people who work there, and I'd just like to recognize the electrophysiology team here at Children's Hospital Pittsburgh. Thank you.
Thank you, Halki, for that overview of how we can do electrophysiology in children. We now have some time for discussion, and before we open it up to the panel, there are a few questions to answer that are coming in, and they're for Halki, actually. There are two questions. One is, how comparable are results from one lab to another for electrophysiology testing? And the second, and maybe we can open this up to the panel after Halki answers, do we even need ERG anymore with genetic testing available?
So two very interesting questions. I think the International Society sponsored some research where they went around from various electrophysiology units in the UK, and what they found was the whole purpose of ISCEF standards is to ensure that the stimuli that we're presenting and the recording techniques that we're using is similar across the laboratories around the world. And as a result, probably about 10–15% test-retest from one laboratory to another. Using skin electrodes, it increased to around 30%. I think that depends on the people doing the skin recording. So there's a lot of artifacts that you can creep into skin recordings, and you just need to be aware of those. In terms of whether we need electrophysiology anymore, I think what's quite interesting is that when we deep phenotype patients, that's how we find these new genes. And I think one of the components of phenotyping is electrophysiology. And I think what usually follows a paper that shows that this particular phenotype has a particular gene abnormality is a paper that follows afterwards that says, actually, we have a different phenotype that has the same gene abnormality. So I think it's just one of the cogs that helps in terms of the phenotyping and refining the diagnosis. So although electrophysiology has been around for a long time, I'm not sure it's ready to disappear yet.
Well, I would be surprised if an electrophysiologist gave a different answer than the answer you just gave. I'm sure there are many comments from the panel on this topic.
Okay, I'll be interested.
Let's say David first. Go ahead, David.
I think in defence of electrophysiology, you can't monitor progression of the disease based on genetics, so we need to do electrophysiology. Although I think we will be going through a forced trial at the moment. One of the first services to shut down at our eye hospitals for COVID-19 was the electrophysiology service. You can still get a DNA test done, but you can't get the electrophysiology done. And if we have a huge number of people needing to be tested for what all the chloroquine that's been taken has done, they may be overwhelmed with work for the next year. So I think we will see more DNA testing done because of that, and we'll be able to get a better idea of it.
Elias, did you have something to add? Yeah.
Yes, I was going to say that I have been in the two camps. I was in the camp of we don't need it for diagnosis for a while when our focus was on diagnosis. But I've learned over the years that, number one, as good as you may be, there are cases that you are going to miss. And I've learned also that if you want to make sure your clinical diagnosis fits with your molecular diagnosis, in some patients, you do need the electrophysiology. And now that we are in the era of treatments, just like David just mentioned, we absolutely need it. And we're fortunate that, number one, the technical aspects of it have gotten so much better, and you can get reliable and reproducible measurements. You do need to have people who know what they're doing to do it, and unfortunately there aren't that many of them out there. And finally, we have to get that message out that it is absolutely necessary for many patients, not for all patients, but definitely a huge and helpful part of the patient's workup.
I think Elias makes a fantastic point about you can buy an electrophysiology system off the shelf, and the distributor will tell you that they will train you within 2 days to use the system. And these are with people who have never used the equipment before, because with a control subject, they can put the electrodes on, they can run the program, but there's so many other things that are involved in determining whether the results you're getting are accurate and reproducible. And again, that's why I pay homage to my electrophysiology team here, who've been with me for some time now, and they continue to learn, and we're all learning. I think it's not a push-button machine. There's so many other variables that determine whether the responses we're recording are hand-on-heart normal or not.
Yeah, Birgit, just quickly so we can move on to the other points.
I would like to add, especially in smaller children where the retina may be quite unremarkable, and we don't know yet what gene may be affected, and we have got to remember that it's only about 70 to 80% that can be identified on a molecular level. So for those children, I think it's very good to do electrophysiology, and it is essential.
And
I just want to mention one other quick point on this vein. Sometimes the electrophysiology, and it's usually the electrophysiology is non-specific, but sometimes it's diagnostic for a particular gene mutation. And there have been situations where the electrophysiology is right and the genetic testing is wrong, and the electrophysiology wins in some certain conditions. So I think the summary is that, yes, we still need electrophysiology. Now, there's one other thing that came from the questions that I really want to have the panel address, because I think it's important, and then we'll open up to discussion anything the panel wants to discuss about. One of the things that was asked is, you know, as Elias had mentioned, and it was mentioned by Birgit as well, when we have an inherited retinal dystrophy, we want to ask some certain questions. What are the questions that people ask? Maybe we can go around the panel and get maybe 1 or 2 questions that we think are important to ask when a child comes in with a retinal dystrophy in the review of systems. David, child comes in with retinal dystrophy. Is there 1 or 2? And then we'll just go across to see if people have additional things.
Well, the thing that I really stress is sorting out the family history and working out that there aren't second cousins and great uncles who might have a similar thing, so an extended family history, and if possible examining or getting the notes of that relative can really cast an interesting explanation for what is going on.
Birgit?
Yes, of course the pedigree is the basis, no doubt. And then, of course, as Elias has already said, ask for additional features like delay or in development, or normal development in the beginning, and then a delay in development for NCL, for example. And then, of course, also asking for additional digits, etc., that may have been removed without the parents telling you immediately. So the general questions are really important. Hearing impairment, so many more features, of course.
Elias, you have anything to add, or?
This is most of it. Happy to share our questionnaire that has these pointed questions that you mentioned with everyone. Maybe I'll put it on the Facebook chat so people can get access to it. You can add like anosmia. There's a few rare things, but for the most part, if you first ask them whether there are symptoms that indicate difficulties with night vision as opposed to difficulties with color vision and day vision, and then you add to it questions that probe for neurological regression and degeneration or other neurological issues. Developmental delay is a difficult one to ask because you can never tell kidney function unless it's advanced. You can't pick it up on a questionnaire. but hearing loss you can, of course, polydactyly, as you mentioned, and a history of having a digit removed, that you can ask.
Eduardo, did you covered a lot?
Yeah, well, a lot has been covered already, but one of the things that are always asked in my patient population is the geographical origin of both the maternal and the paternal side of the family, because this usually brings you to one village, 2 generations up. And the odds that 100 years ago you would go and travel 50 kilometers to get married was extremely low. So the consanguinity is something that is usually my first go. And then there are other things like infertility, history, a prior history of abortions, miscarriages. It's important to know, and other minor things like kidney function. You should specifically ask for very signs that patients are not going to think about, like if they had their teeth removed because they had some sort of dental changes or dental anomalies, and now they're wearing a prosthetic device, and you're looking at very nice and bright teeth, but they're not their own. So all of these issues are something that you learn with time and will point you towards some direction.
One other thing that I've come across rarely is asking about diet, because sometimes these patients are on very strange diets and they can actually get dietary deficiencies, and along with that, medications as well.
Yep.
So I'd like to open up to the panel for any further discussion. Let me just see if there are any other questions.
Yeah, well, one of the questions that's now on is what is the cost of gene therapy, and is there a possibility of bringing this cost down? Does anyone have something to add about
Well,
this?
I can say that, in the UAE, the government has negotiated with the provider of Luxturna for the price, and they came to agreement, and they are providing it for the citizens of the country. So governments need to recognize that it's an effective treatment. They have to look at their population and decide whether or not it's something they should offer within their country or have an agreement elsewhere. But governments have a role in negotiating what the price should be.
Yes, and that's exactly the same that's happening right now in Portugal. The government is negotiating with a company, and I believe that patient organizations have a crucial role in this, because they are the ones that really can put all the a lot of pressure into getting things done and looking at the economic and their lifestyle to the table.
I want to add here. I don't know how many people in the audience know, but there's a huge number of these patients in Costa Rica. I can't remember the numbers, 40, 50, 60, I don't know. And we all know the economic status of that country. And I don't know the outcome, but I also heard that there were some negotiations to get treatment to those individuals. So whatever we could do to support that happening, I think is good.
And the price is also in the UK and also in Germany, but it's still quite high. In Germany, it's now about 350,000 euro per eye. But it was much higher before. It was about 20% higher. I don't know if you know, Elias, for the US, if there's any change in price, or Eduardo, do you know the price?
I know of.
Well, I'm not sure how the negotiation is going on right now, but I think that the government is trying to bring it down a little bit, and obviously this probably will reflect in other countries in the world, because once you get to a certain point, then it's easier for others to negotiate at the same level. I would like to bring up something really important. And David Mackey, I really loved your talk. One very important thing is what you tell your patients. And really, one of the points that you brought up, which is quite interesting, is, and I get this all the time with my patients, is they ask, will I be able to drive? And my answer most of the times right now is that, yes, if you buy a car that does not need a driver, or if you have a chauffeur, probably that's doable. So the amount of information and what you give your patient is really crucial, and you pointed that out in your talk. Just develop a little bit more on that, because I really enjoyed it.
I think one of the challenges with the driverless cars being brought in generally is who's taking responsibility. And I think there's a real opportunity for us to push people who used to drive, who are now visually impaired, as being the ideal people to prototype test within our communities driverless cars, because they're not really driverless, but they're using all the LiDAR technologies. And I think that's an opportunity that we should be looking at and get the companies to sponsor it, because if they've got visually impaired people using their technology, then later on they'll be able to have anybody using it.
Yeah, I agree. Elias?
I adore the talks that David Mackey gives. And in 2017, David gave a lecture at the International Society of Genetic Eye Disease meeting, the Francischetti lecture, that I think the audience needs to view. It is an expansion on what they heard today, and it's called the Francischetti lecture. You can go on the ISGEDAR website and listen to the recording. It's available. Everybody can access it. And the paper was just published in Ophthalmic Genetic this past year that summarizes this. So go listen to David later and learn. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Elias.
There's another question that's come in, and it's again about RP65 treatment. What's the youngest patient that can be treated? What's the oldest patient that can be treated? Birgit?
That's a difficult one. For the youngest patient, I think it's the surgical challenges that have got to be taken into consideration. At least the vitreoretinal surgeons would not be very confident to do a surgery before the age of 2 years. Because, of course, thinking about degeneration, you may want to do it early on. On the other hand, there is still developing retinal cells. I think the youngest patient treated so far was about 2 years old. Maybe others know better than me too. The oldest, it depends on the disease stage, I think. There is milder forms of RP65 mutations that patients may have still quite good viable cells until the age of 40 or 50 or even later. And there is some report that even in patients who have only light perception, the therapy may work. I don't know whether this has been published, but Leroy has talked about that. I don't know if any from the panel have experience with those very advanced stages who receive treatment.
So it's going back to what you said before. It's more about viable retinal cells than the absolute age. But in general, older patients tend to have less viable retinal cells. There's another question that's come up in the chat again regarding RP65. How long does the treatment last?
Well, the data are in the dog, and the dog, the most famous, he lived until the age of 10 or 11 or 12, I think. And apparently there were still viable cells in the dog. However, we have got to acknowledge that the dogs have a different course of the disease, with better preserved cells at least until the age of 8 months or so. And I just want to point again to the paper I alluded to that has been recently published. Again, looking into preservation of the morphology from the same Jacobson group. And apparently they have found areas with much better preserved morphology, and those areas, I think it was again in the dog, tended to keep the good morphology following gene therapy. And when there were already advanced stages of atrophy, as they have published previously, despite the preservation of the functional benefit as shown by the MLMT, the morphology continued to worsen. So I think it's a complex question, and of course in the individual patient it may be quite difficult to know, even with the use of OCT, how advanced cell degeneration is already. So that's why I said we need really to monitor all patients that do receive Luxturna with the best possible phenotyping we can, because of course it's an important question, is it only for 10 years or longer? And in this respect there's another paper showing from the Jean Bennett and Albert Maguire group that repeat injection in the same eye was possible and did not destroy the beneficial effect with the first treatment. So that is also important. And I think when we think about the patients who have very good vision and good morphology, as I showed those patients, and we have some patients that have a very slow degeneration, we have observed this, and the London group also has shown that some patients really advance only very slowly. So from a theoretical point of view, they would be good candidates. On the other hand, we have got to acknowledge that with the therapy, with the detachment, we may cause some damage. So it's a difficult decision. I think for me, it's more difficult to decide how good the retina can be to advise therapy than how bad the retina is already, because of the possibility of damage we are causing with the surgery.
Yeah, we have 2 minutes left. I would like to just bring another issue up for the panel, which is who gives the gene results, the gene testing results to patients? Who should do this? This is really something crucial, because I don't think that a lot of the normal general ophthalmologists are proficient enough to be able to do this. And I would like to have your opinions, your views with regards to this. David.
Well, I think the best person is the person who understands the results and has the best interaction with the patient. So it will be a different scenario with different patients and different settings. So I think any of the panelists here could quite easily give a genetic result back to a patient. However, in other circumstances, you might want to have a genetic counsellor or a clinical geneticist, ideally one that has worked with that family. The thing that we're now going to see a lot more as we're doing web interactions is I think that we can have specialty trained people. I have a genetic counsellor in Australia who does all the Leber's optic neuropathy testing, result feedback and counselling, and she knows all the families, is real authority on the disease, and having her talk over the phone rather than in person, I think is a lot better than having a local person who doesn't know as much about the disease.
Well, I think it also depends when it's a clear-cut result, just clear mutation in one gene. But nowadays, results come back from NGS testing, etc., where it's complex results, mutations with unknown significance, maybe genes that play also a role in the pathway that the disease-causing gene is important. So in those instances, I think it's really a well-trained molecular geneticist who has got to explain those results.
Yeah, I agree. Elias, 1 minute. David will take the stage afterwards.
Ophthalmologists are not used to giving out bad news. They're used to giving good news. Sometimes giving the results of a genetic test are bad news. Sometimes they're not, but there are nuances in how to do it. One time I remember telling a mom about her 2 boys having an X-linked recessive RP, and they were sitting there. I didn't pay attention to that. Their grandfather had gone blind with it, and they've seen him do that. So I think it should be given by somebody who knows the disease, who knows the genetics, who knows the impact, who's sensitive, who's empathetic. I think genetic counselors, experienced genetic counselors in eye diseases are indeed the best, or it could be done in a team fashion between the ophthalmologist and the genetic counselor.
Yes. Thank you very much for your views. David Granite, the stage is yours. Thank you very much to all the panelists and my co-host.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you all. This was an amazing discussion, and I can tell you online it was lit up, and we've had viewership already in the thousands of people around the world. So you have touched and educated people worldwide. I also, the last two Menti questions I wanted to make sure we touched on. Alki, your Menti question was, how do you record ERG responses in children under 5 years old? About 30% said they don't attempt it. They don't even try. And then it was split between patient awake with skin electrodes and with the patient asleep. It was exactly split between those two as otherwise for the people who did try it. And then for the panel, we have a fabulous word cloud that's being generated as what, according to you, is the best part of the webinar. And in giant letters, it says the word discussion. So thank you all for your expertise and bringing such a great discussion, literally, to the world. David Mackey, I apologize. It's late there, and I know you want to go to sleep. So,
It's Saturday night.
Yes, it's Saturday night. So we want to end up. We want to thank again Novartis for their sponsorship. NTOG, congratulations on your Founders Day, the 43rd Founders Day. And to all of you, we look forward to seeing you on our next series of webinars on aniridia, pediatric glaucoma, and then we'll have a worldwide quiz that we're going to do and see which regions of the world compete against each other. And finally, we'll go back to the Worldwide Connect that's coming, and look for it. So on behalf of our moderators, on behalf of our spectacular panelists who have given quite a bit of their time in preparation for this, we deeply thank you for sharing of your knowledge, and it is just pretty special to be part of a world where people share their knowledge for free. WSPOS membership is free. You can become a part just by going to wspos.org. You can write me at dgranite.ucsd.edu if you want to be part of the international listserv. Let us know. Join the conversation. Thank you all again, and we look forward to everyone joining us next week on our next webinar on aniridia. After that, again, glaucoma. Thank you all, and have a great day or a great night, wherever you are around the world. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
केतन भाई स्टॉप करो।